The mining ship called Horizon's Edge moved slowly through the asteroid field in the outer part of the Kepler system, and its job was to look for valuable minerals that could be sold back on Earth. Captain Daniel Price stood on the bridge and watched the computer screens with tired eyes because 3 years of mining in deep space had taught him that most days were just boring and nothing exciting ever happened. The ship's navigation officer was a woman named Lisa Morgan, and she sat at her station moving her fingers across the controls when suddenly she noticed something strange on her scanner. She called out to Daniel and told him there was a massive energy reading coming from an asteroid marked as K447, and it was unlike anything she had ever seen in the ship's database. Daniel walked closer to her station and asked her how massive the energy signature was, and Lisa looked at the numbers again before telling him that it should not be possible for a natural rock formation to give off this much power, and it was almost like there was a reactor core hidden inside the asteroid itself. Daniel made his choice quickly, because even though mining was boring, this was the first interesting thing that had happened in months, so he ordered the crew to change course and move the ship closer so they could investigate what was causing such strange readings. As the Horizon's Edge got closer to the asteroid, the entire crew became silent and stared at what they were seeing. On the main view screen, the asteroid was huge and easily 5 kilometers wide, but that was not what made everyone stop talking, because embedded inside the rock they could see metal that was smooth and shiny and completely unmarked by time or space damage. The metal seemed to glow with its own inner light, and the design was clearly not natural but made by intelligent beings. Kyle Barnes was the ship's engineer, and he whispered from his station, asking if they were really seeing what he thought they were seeing. Daniel could barely breathe as he said yes, it was a ship buried inside the asteroid, and he wondered how long it had been there waiting to be found. Lisa ran more detailed scans, and her face turned pale as she read the results, and after a moment she told Daniel that according to the mineral deposits that had formed around the ship, it had been inside this asteroid for at least 50,000 years, and maybe even longer than that. The information hit everyone on the bridge like a physical punch, because 50,000 years ago humans on Earth were still learning how to make fire and hunt animals with stone tools, and they definitely did not have spaceships or any kind of advanced technology. Whatever civilization had built this enormous vessel was so ancient that it made human history look like it had just started yesterday. Lisa continued reading her scans, and her voice shook a little as she reported that there was more strange news, because the energy signature was getting stronger every second, and it seemed like their presence near the asteroid had triggered something inside the old ship, and now it was waking up after sleeping for thousands of centuries. Daniel felt a cold chill run down his back, and he ordered Lisa to give him a complete scan of the vessel, because he wanted to know everything possible about it before they made any more decisions. Over the next hour, the crew of the Horizon's Edge gathered information that would change everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe. The ancient ship was enormous at 3 kilometers long, and it was built with materials and technology that made their own mining ship look like a primitive toy made by children. But the most shocking discovery was about where the ship had come from, because Lisa found something that made no sense at all. She told Daniel in a quiet voice that the markings on the hull and the design elements and even the mathematical proportions used in the construction were all based on Earth measurements like meters and not on alien units that a different species would use. Lisa insisted that this ship had been built by humans, or at least by beings who used exactly the same measurement systems that humans had developed on Earth. Kyle argued that this was impossible, because humans did not have spaceflight 50,000 years ago, and they barely even had farming or cities back then. Lisa told him she understood it seemed crazy, but she was just reporting what the data clearly showed, and the probability of this being a random coincidence was so low it was basically zero. Daniel stared at the ancient vessel floating in space, and his mind raced with possibilities and questions. He asked Lisa if they could board the ship safely, and she looked at her scans before answering that there was a docking port on the hull that still looked intact and functional. But Lisa had to warn Daniel that she strongly advised against going inside, because they had no idea what was waiting for them in there, or why the ship had started waking up when they arrived. Daniel listened to her warning and then simply said "noted" before ordering the crew to prepare a boarding party, because there was no way he was going to pass up this opportunity to explore a ship that might hold the secrets of humanity's forgotten past. 2 hours later, Daniel stood in the airlock, wearing a heavy exploration suit, and with him were Kyle and a security officer named Greg Turner, who carried weapons just in case they met something hostile. The connection between the Horizon's Edge and the ancient ship had been surprisingly easy to make, and it seemed like the old vessel had been designed specifically to accept their docking clamps, as if it had been waiting for humans to find it. The airlock went through its cycle and the inner door opened with a hiss of air pressure equalizing, and to everyone's amazement, the corridor beyond the door was lit up with a soft blue glow, and when they checked their suit readings, the atmosphere showed as completely breathable for humans. Kyle said in a voice full of wonder that the ship had somehow terraformed itself and created an environment that humans could survive in because it had detected their arrival and wanted to welcome them aboard. They walked through corridors that seemed alive with energy, and the walls were covered in strange symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if human eyes were not meant to see them clearly. The deeper Daniel and his team went into the ship, the more he felt like something ancient and powerful was watching them and waiting to see what they would do. Finally, they reached a room that could only be the command center, and it was a vast circular space with a raised platform in the very center. On that platform, suspended inside a column of shimmering energy that moved like liquid light, was a figure that looked human. The figure wore armor that seemed to be made from solidified starlight, and its eyes were closed like it was sleeping, but as Daniel and his crew got closer, those eyes suddenly snapped open and they blazed with power that made Daniel take an involuntary step backward in fear. The figure spoke, and somehow they could understand every word, even though the language was nothing they had ever heard before in their lives. The voice said, "I am Commander Jacob Stone of the Terran Guardian Fleet, and I have been asleep for 50,000 years waiting for the day when my children would return and find me. That day has finally come, but I must give you grave news because the darkness that forced us to flee has returned, and it hunts across the stars once more, looking for any trace of human life to destroy." The column of energy around Jacob Stone faded away like morning mist, and he stepped down from the platform, moving with the grace and power of a trained warrior who had seen countless battles. He looked at Daniel and Kyle and Greg with eyes that held both sadness and determination, and a small smile crossed his ancient face as he told them they had grown so much since the old days. Jacob explained that humans had forgotten the wars of ancient times and forgotten the great empire they had built among the stars, but now they needed to remember everything because the Devourers had awakened and they were hungry for the light of every living world in the galaxy. Daniel found his voice, even though it came out barely louder than a whisper, and he asked Jacob who he really was and what exactly were these Devourers that he kept talking about. Jacob's smile disappeared and was replaced by a look of grim seriousness as he began to explain that he was the last of the old Guardians and the final warrior of an empire that had once ruled 10,000 worlds across the galaxy. He told them the Devourers were the end of all things, and they were entities from beyond the rim of the galaxy that existed only to consume entire civilizations and leave nothing behind but empty darkness. Jacob walked over to a control panel and placed his hand on it, and suddenly the entire command center came alive with holographic displays that showed star systems beyond counting and massive fleets of ships and terrible things that defied description because they were masses of writhing darkness that actually consumed stars themselves. Jacob continued his explanation and said the Devourers had destroyed the human empire and scattered humanity to primitive worlds across the galaxy, and he had been left here to watch over Earth and wait until humans were ready to face the darkness again. Kyle protested and said that humans were not ready at all because they had barely colonized their own solar system and they did not have the weapons or technology needed to fight. Something as powerful as what Jacob was describing. Jacob manipulated the holographic controls and showed them more images as he told Kyle that humans had more strength than they knew, because the blood of the old empire still ran in their veins and the courage that had allowed humanity to rule the stars still beat in their hearts. He said he had spent 50,000 years preparing for this exact moment, and his ship called the Eternal Vigil contained all the knowledge and weapons from the old times, and with these tools humanity could stand against the darkness once more. Daniel felt the enormous weight of destiny settling on his shoulders because he had come out here looking for valuable minerals to mine, and instead he had found the key to humanity's forgotten past and dangerous future. Jacob's voice became heavy with urgency as he told them the Devourers were only 3 months away from reaching human space, because they had been drawn by the radio, signals that Earth had been broadcasting into space for the past century. The machines knew that humanity had returned to the stars, and now they were coming to finish what they had started 50,000 years ago and wipe out every last trace of human existence. Daniel's voice grew stronger with determination as he said, they needed to warn Earth immediately and prepare every ship and every weapon and every person who could fight for the battle that was coming. Jacob nodded with approval and said Daniel spoke like a true guardian, and there was much that needed to be taught, but time was growing dangerously short. The eternal vigil had to fly again, and humanity needed to remember what it truly meant to be the masters of their own fate and defenders of their own survival. The journey back to Earth took 3 days even, with the eternal vigil's advanced engines helping to push the horizon's edge faster than it had ever traveled before. During those 3 days, Jacob gave Daniel and his crew a complete education in galactic history that completely rewrote everything they thought they knew about where humans came from. Jacob stood before a massive holographic display of the entire Milky Way galaxy and explained that humanity had not evolved only on Earth in isolation. He told them that 52,000 years ago humans were not primitive cave dwellers, but instead they were a mighty empire called the Terran Sovereignty that controlled 18,000 star systems and had a population of more than 2 trillion people living on worlds across the galaxy. Lisa shook her head in complete disbelief and said this contradicted everything that human scientists knew about evolution, because the fossil records on Earth showed a continuous development going back millions of years with no gaps or missing time. Jacob smiled grimly and told her that was because the ancient humans had made sure the records would look that way. When the Devourers came and could not be stopped, the leaders of the Terran Sovereignty, I knew they could not win a direct war, so they created something called Protocol Omega. This plan involved seeding primitive versions of humanity across 1,000 different worlds and wiping their memories clean and setting their technology and civilization back to the Stone Age. Earth was the most important world in this plan because it was where they placed their greatest hope for humanity's future rebirth. Jacob changed the holographic display to show Earth surrounded by a web of invisible energy, and he explained that he and 9 other guardians had placed themselves in suspended animation and hidden themselves in the outer reaches of each seeded world star system. They became silent watchers who waited patiently for the day when humanity would rediscover spaceflight and need their guidance and protection once more. Greg asked quietly what had happened to the other 9 guardians, and Jacob's expression became dark and troubled. He said he did not know their fate because he had lost all contact with them 20,000 years ago, and either their equipment had failed or they had been discovered and destroyed by the Devourers, or something else had gone wrong. Jacob admitted he might be the very last guardian left alive in the entire galaxy. Daniel studied the galactic map carefully and noticed how the human colonies were spread out across space, like some kind of defensive network. He asked if all of this had been planned from the very beginning, and if their entire history had been decided by the ancient empire. Jacob corrected him gently and said they had not planned humanity's history, but only given them the tools and genetic potential to rebuild what humans had actually built with their civilizations and cultures and achievements was entirely their own creation, and Jacob said they had done it faster than the Guardians had dared to. Dream was possible. Kyle brought up a tactical display on another screen and asked Jacob to explain exactly what the Devourers were and how they operated. Jacob's face became hard as stone, and he told them the Devourers were machines, but not like any machines that modern humans had ever built or imagined. They had been created by a civilization that had existed long before any life evolved in this galaxy, and that ancient race had transcended physical form and left their machine guardians behind. The Devourers were originally meant to maintain balance in the galaxy and prevent any single species from growing too powerful and dominating all others. But something had gone terribly wrong with their programming, and they had become corrupted, and now they saw all organic life as a disease that needed to be completely purged from existence. The hologram shifted and showed nightmarish machines that seemed to swallow light itself, and they were massive beyond imagination, with some being as large as entire moons, while others stretched across space like living shadows that consumed everything in their path. Jacob continued his explanation and told them the Devourers did not just consume physical resources, like metal or fuel. But they also destroyed information and culture, and even the quantum signatures of every being they killed so that nothing remained behind, not even ruins or memories. The Terran sovereignty had fought against them for an entire century, before the human leaders finally realized they could not win this war no matter how hard they tried. Daniel's voice was firm as he said that humans were going to fight the Devourers now, even though they had far less power and technology than the ancient empire had possessed. Jacob agreed and told him yes, they would fight, but modern humans had certain advantages that the old empire did not have because they were unpredictable and wild in ways that the ancient civilization had forgotten over time. The old empire had become rigid and filled with bureaucracy and slow to adapt to new situations, but modern humans were still close to their primitive roots and still had the fire of survival burning inside them, and Jacob believed that might be enough to make the difference. The Eternal Vigil entered Earth's solar system and found complete chaos waiting for them, because every military vessel that humanity possessed was scrambling into defensive positions after receiving the warning transmission that the Horizon's Edge had sent ahead. As they got closer to Earth, a fleet of warships surrounded them with all weapons powered up and targeting systems locked onto the ancient vessel. A stern voice came over the radio and identified itself as Admiral Richard Carter, commanding the Earth Defense Force flagship Liberty, and he ordered the unidentified vessel to power down its weapons immediately and prepare to be boarded. Daniel transmitted a response from the Horizon's Edge and explained that he was Captain Daniel Price, and the mysterious ship they were tracking was called the Eternal Vigil, and it was not a threat but actually their only hope for survival. After many tense negotiations and security checks, they were finally escorted to Luna Station, which was the massive orbital platform that served as the military headquarters for all of humanity's defense forces. Daniel and Jacob were rushed into an emergency meeting of the Global Defense Council as soon as they docked. The council chamber was filled with military, leaders and politicians and scientists from every major nation on Earth, and they all looked worried and confused. Admiral Carter stood at the head of the long table, and his face was grave with concern as he addressed Daniel and told him they had reviewed his preliminary report. Carter said he understood how completely insane this all sounded, with ancient human empires and machine entities that devoured civilizations, because it read exactly like bad science fiction. Daniel replied that he knew how crazy it sounded, but he had brought proof with him in the form of Commander Stone himself. Jacob entered the chamber, and immediately a heavy silence fell over the entire room, because he wore his ancient armor that gleamed with barely contained power and energy. Every military sensor in the station was screaming warnings about the incredible energy readings coming from his equipment and weapons. Jacob spoke with a voice that carried natural authority and made even hardened warriors sit up straighter in their seats as he introduced himself as the last guardian of Earth. He told them they had exactly 3 months to prepare for the greatest threat that humanity had ever faced in its entire history, and they could choose to believe him or not, but he would show them what was coming regardless of their doubts. Jacob activated a holographic projector that was built into his armor, and suddenly the room was filled with horrifying images of the Devourers in action. The council members watched in growing horror as entire battle fleets were torn apart like paper, and planets were stripped down to their rocky cores, and stars were drained of all their energy until they went dark and cold. Jacob told them this was what had destroyed the Terran sovereignty and scattered humanity across the galaxy like seeds in the wind, and this same nightmare was coming for them now because it had been drawn by their radio signals and ships moving through space. Humanity had announced its presence to the galaxy, and the Devourers had heard that announcement and were coming to investigate. A woman stood up and her name tag showed. She was Senator Patricia Brooks, and she asked the obvious question, that even if they believed everything Jacob was saying, how could they possibly fight something so powerful? She pointed out that Earth's entire military fleet consisted of maybe 300 ships, and most of those were designed for exploration and scientific research, not for war. Jacob told her simply that they would learn how to fight, and the Eternal Vigil contained fabrication systems that could build weapons and armor and ships using designs from the old empire. But more importantly, his ship contained training protocols that could teach human warriors to fight the way the old Guardians had fought and turn ordinary soldiers into living weapons themselves. Admiral Carter leaned forward across the table and asked Jacob what exactly he was proposing they do. Jacob's answer was direct and clear as he said, total mobilization of every resource and every factory and every able-bodied person with one single goal, which was building a fleet capable of meeting the Devourers in battle. He told them bluntly that they could not outrun the machines and they could not hide from them, so the only option left was to stand their ground and fight. General Paul Martinez, who was the head of the Interplanetary Marines, asked how many Devourers were coming toward Earth. Jacob's expression became grim as he told them his sensors had detected a vanguard force of 17 Harvester-class units, which were supported by approximately 300 smaller drone ships. He explained that in the old days the Terran sovereignty would have sent a fleet of 10,000 vessels to engage a force of that size, but humanity now only had 300 ships, and most of them were civilian vessels with improvised weapons bolted onto their hulls. The room erupted in panicked conversation as everyone began talking at once because the math was simple and absolutely terrifying. They were hopelessly outnumbered and facing an enemy that had already destroyed a civilization far more advanced than their own. Daniel stood up and his voice cut through the chaos like a knife. As he said they would make every single ship count. He proposed using guerrilla tactics and hit-and-run attacks and anything else that would let them punch above their weight class. Daniel said they could not afford to fight fair because fairness would get them all killed. Jacob nodded with approval and said the captain spoke true wisdom, because the Devourers expected resistance to follow the patterns of the past. The machines expected formation battles and attempts to hold territory, but humanity would give them none of that predictability. Instead, they would be ghosts in the darkness who struck where the enemy was weak and vanished before the machines could respond with their full power. Admiral Carter asked what the Eternal Vigil could actually do in battle, and Jacob's face broke into a fierce smile as he explained that in its day the ancient ship had been classified as a dreadnought, and it was one of only 50 such vessels ever built by the Terran sovereignty. He said the Eternal Vigil could engage and destroy any single harvester with relative ease, but fighting against 17 of them at once was beyond even its capabilities. Jacob told them the ancient ship would serve as their flagship and mobile fortress, and most importantly as their forge, because from it they would build all the tools of war and coordinate the defense of humanity. Carter asked how long it would take to outfit their existing fleet with these new weapons, and Jacob calculated quickly in his head before answering. He said if they worked day and night without stopping, and if they stripped every useful resource from the asteroid belt, and if they drafted every engineer and factory worker into service, then they could have basic weapon systems installed in 7 weeks, and full integration completed in 10 weeks. Jacob warned them they would be working right up until the very moment the Devourers arrived at Earth. Daniel looked around the room at the faces of Earth's leaders, and he saw fear and determination mixed together in equal amounts. He said they needed to tell the people of Earth what was coming, because they deserved to know the truth. Senator Brooks shook her head firmly and argued that if they announced this publicly, there would be mass panic and riots in the streets of every city. Daniel shot back that then they would have riots, but they would also have unity, because people needed to know what they were fighting for, and they needed to understand this was a choice between extinction and survival, with nothing in between. Jacob placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and said the captain was absolutely correct, because in the old days the Empire's leaders had kept secrets from the common people and tried to manage their fear, but that approach had made them weak. Jacob believed that humanity was strongest when it knew the brutal truth and chose to fight anyway. Despite impossible odds, Admiral Carter made his final decision and said they would go public with full disclosure and begin immediate mobilization. He ordered General Martinez to start training every able-bodied person of military age for combat, because they would need ground forces if the Devourers managed to reach Earth's surface. Jacob said quietly that some machines would definitely get through no matter how well they fought in space, and humanity had to be ready for that horror as well. The meeting continued for many more hours as they planned and prepared for a war unlike anything humanity had ever faced before. When it finally ended and people began filing out to start their assigned tasks, Daniel found himself standing alone with Jacob, while looking at a holographic display of Earth floating peacefully in space. Daniel asked if Jacob truly thought they could win this war, and Jacob was silent for a long moment before answering. He said he thought humanity could survive, and whether that was the same thing as winning, he did not really know. The old empire had been mighty beyond imagination, and it had still fallen before the Devourers, but modern humans had something the ancient civilization had lost. Jacob said they still knew how to hope against impossible odds, and that quality might be enough to tip the balance. Daniel asked what would happen if hope was not enough, and Jacob replied with a grim smile. He said then they would make their final stand so memorable that when the Devourers consumed the last humans, they would choke on humanity's defiance. They would make humanity's final chapter a testament to courage, so powerful that somewhere in the universe, when the next species rose to challenge the darkness, they would find humanity's legend and draw strength from it. Daniel nodded slowly and said, then they should get to work because they had 3 months to prepare, and he intended to make every single day count for something. As they left the council chamber, alarms began to sound across Luna Station, but these were not warning alarms but mobilization calls. Across Earth and all its colonies, millions of people would soon learn they were not alone in the universe, and that what they had found wanted them completely dead. 6 weeks passed in a blur of constant activity, and the transformation of human space was nothing short of miraculous. Every asteroid mining facility had been converted to weapons production, and every shipyard worked around the clock modifying civilian vessels into warships. The Eternal Vigil hung in orbit around Mars, and its fabrication bays ran at full capacity, producing weapons and armor that seemed like pure magic to human engineers. Commander Jacob. Stone stood on the observation deck of Luna Station watching the fleet assemble below, and where once there had been 300 ships, now there were 500, with more arriving daily from the outer colonies. General Martinez stood beside him and said it still was not enough, because even with the weapon upgrades they were outnumbered and outgunned. Jacob replied that numbers were not everything, and the Devourers relied on overwhelming force and predictable tactics. He said they had not faced an enemy that could adapt and improvise in 50,000 years, and that gave humanity a slim edge. Below them in training, facilities that now covered a quarter of the moons, surfaced 50,000 Marines drilled in combat techniques that mixed human military doctrine with the ancient fighting styles of the Terran sovereignty. Jacob had shared knowledge that turned ordinary soldiers into something more, by enhancing their reflexes and strategic thinking, and their ability to function as one unified force. Lieutenant Sam Cooper emerged from one of these brutal training sessions, and his body was now augmented with basic neural enhancements that Jacob's medical systems could provide. He moved with fluid grace that would have been impossible 2 months ago, and his reaction times had been increased by a factor of 5. Sam saluted Jacob and reported that 3rd Battalion was ready for deployment because all 2,000 Marines had completed the enhancement protocol. Jacob asked how they felt, and Sam replied with a fierce grin that they felt like they could take on the entire universe, though the psychological briefings about what they were actually facing had helped temper that enthusiasm somewhat. Captain Daniel Price arrived looking completely exhausted because he had been overseeing the integration of the Eternal Vigil systems with human ships, and the task required him to be in 3 places at once. He said without greeting that they had serious problems because the destroyer Valiant had tried to fire its new plasma cannons and nearly torn itself apart when the power conduits could not handle the energy load. Jacob asked if the engineers had followed his specifications exactly, and Daniel admitted they had said it would take too long, so they tried to find a shortcut. Jacob's expression became hard as iron, and he said in war there were no shortcuts but only corpses. He ordered the Valiant to return to dock for proper retrofitting, and told Daniel to make sure every other ship knew to follow the designs exactly, or they would die when they needed their weapons most. Admiral Carter's voice came over the station intercom, ordering all senior staff to report to the command center immediately, because they had an urgent update from the Deep Space Sensor Network. Everyone rushed to the command center, where Carter stood before a massive holographic display, showing the solar system and the space beyond it with red markers indicating the approaching Devourer fleet. Carter looked grim as he announced that the enemy had accelerated their approach, and new projections put their arrival at 7 weeks instead of the original 12 weeks. The Devourers were coming much faster than anyone had thought possible, and they were running out of time. Senator Brooks asked why they had suddenly sped up, and Jacob studied the display while his enhanced mind processed the data faster than any computer could. He explained that the machines knew humanity was preparing for war, because somewhere in the void they had detected the increased activity and weapons tests and fleet movements. The Devourers were moving quickly to attack before Earth was ready to defend itself properly. General Martinez asked if they could somehow speed up their preparations to match the new timeline, but Daniel replied that they were already working at maximum capacity, and they could not go any faster without sacrificing quality and safety. Jacob made a decision and said they would change the entire plan because they would not wait for the Devourers to come to them, but instead would go out to meet the enemy in deep space. Admiral Carter protested and said that was suicide because they were not ready for a full engagement yet. Jacob countered that they would never truly be ready, but if they engaged the machines in deep space far away from Earth and the colonies, they would have room to maneuver. He said they could use the asteroid belt as cover and set up ambushes and fight on their own terms instead of the enemy's terms. Daniel agreed slowly and said if the Devourers reached Earth's orbit, humanity would have no fallback position, but at least in deep space they could retreat and regroup and learn from their mistakes. Carter looked around at his officers and saw reluctant agreement on their faces, so he gave the order to advance the timetable. All ships that were combat-ready would form up within 3 days, and they would establish a defensive line at the orbit of Jupiter over the next 72 hours. Humanity's fleet assembled for the first time in history, and it was 500 ships of various sizes and capabilities. There were massive dreadnoughts built around the frames of cargo haulers and sleek destroyers that had started life as racing yachts, and every vessel bristled with weapons that glowed with strange energies. Jacob stood on the bridge of the Eternal Vigil, which had been designated as the fleet flagship, and around him human officers worked at stations that had been dark for 50,000 years. Lieutenant Helen Foster, who was the communication officer, reported that all ships were ready, and Jacob activated the fleet-wide channel, so his voice would reach every vessel simultaneously. He told the warriors of humanity that they had trained for this moment, and armed themselves with weapons of legend, but weapons alone would not win this war. Jacob said it was their courage and ingenuity and refusal to surrender that would carry the day and make the difference between victory and extinction. He paused to let his words sink in, and then continued by saying the Devourers expected them to be weak and to break and scatter at the first sign of overwhelming power. The machines remembered humanity as an empire that had fallen before them, as an enemy they had utterly defeated. Jacob said the Devourers did not know modern humans and did not understand what it meant to be born from nothing and claw your way to the stars through pure determination. He ordered them to show the machines what humanity truly was and make them fear the name of Earth once more. A tremendous cheer erupted across the fleet as 500 ships' worth of crews shouted their defiance at the darkness between the stars. The fleet moved out, leaving behind the inner solar system and heading for the outer planets, and as they traveled, they continued training by running combat simulations against theoretical devourer tactics. Jacob pushed them incredibly hard and showed no mercy in his critiques when they made mistakes. After one particularly disastrous simulation, he scolded them and said they were fighting like individuals, but the Devourers would tear them apart if they continued that way. He insisted they must think as one and move as one and strike as one, because every ship had to trust that the others would do their part. Captain Ellen Wright of the destroyer. Defiance muttered that this was easy to say, but they barely knew each other, and half these ships were civilian crews who had learned to fire a gun only 3 weeks ago. Jacob replied coldly that they would learn on the battlefield or they would die, because those were the only 2 options available. Despite his harsh methods, or perhaps because of them, the fleet improved rapidly and learned to move in coordinated formations. They practiced focusing fire on single targets and protecting damaged ships while maintaining offensive pressure, and they were becoming the weapon that Jacob needed them to be. 4 weeks into their journey toward the Jupiter defensive line, the forward scouts detected something approaching, and these were ships but not human ones. They were smaller and faster than the massive harvesters and were clearly scouts for the main Devourer force. The sensor operator on the Eternal Vigil reported contact in 3 hours and counted 15 enemy vessels, each approximately 100 meters long, heading directly toward the human fleet. Jacob smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression, and he said finally they had a chance to show these ancient machines that humanity had teeth. He ordered all ships into battle formation Delta and said it was time to introduce themselves to their enemies. The fleet deployed into a 3-dimensional array with the heaviest ships at the center and fast attack craft forming a protective screen around them. The Eternal Vigil took the point position, and its ancient weapon systems came online with a deep hum that resonated through the entire hull. Daniel stood at the tactical station with steady hands despite the fear eating at his insides, because this was the moment of truth. The sensor operator warned that the enemy was charging weapons and their energy signatures were completely off the scale, beyond anything in human experience. Jacob ordered all ships to raise shields to maximum power and wait for his command to fire. The Devourer scouts opened fire first and unleashed beams of coherent energy that seemed to tear holes in reality itself. Human ships rocked violently under the impact as shields flared bright, and in some cases failed completely. 3 ships were destroyed in the first salvo, and they vanished in flashes of light that left no wreckage behind. Jacob roared the command to fire, and the human fleet responded with everything they had, including plasma cannons and railguns and ancient beam, weapons that Jacob had brought back from the old empire. The combined firepower was staggering, and for a brief moment Daniel allowed himself to hope they might actually survive this. The Devourer scouts died one by one as they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of concentrated fire, but they took 7 more human ships with them before the last machine exploded into debris.